Hello and welcome to this Garden to Plate video on worm farming. I'm Chris Lampard. I present the Garden to Plate workshops at the Mandurah Community Gardens and we're funded by Fraser's Landing. So today we were talking about worms and worm farming. So why would you want to set up a worm farm at home? Well, the answer to that question is it can be a very valuable part of your composting system. Worm farms are really good for dealing with kitchen scraps, can sit right outside your door, don't create a huge great big mess the way a compost heap could do. So how do you set up a worm farm? Okay, so you've got a number of choices when you're looking at set up a worm farm. The best way is to go and buy one of the black plastic setups which you get from a gardening store. They're usually around about $80. They consist of 3 trays, one of which catches the liquid, 2 with holes in them and 1 which is just a lid. Okay, if you get those, they're very good, they last a long time and they're very effective. You could use polystyrene boxes. You can also use a plastic tube with holes drilled in it and put those straight in the garden bed. Those are often called worm towers. They work very well. And if you want to get onto a bigger scale, you could get yourself an old fridge. They're often on roadside waste collections. Make sure it's degassed, drill a hole in it, lay it on its side, and that can be used as a giant worm farm. Those can also be very, very effective and deal with larger quantities of material. You take up more space, of course. Okay, so let's imagine you've got your black plastic worm farm. How do you go about setting it up? Well, the first thing you need to do is get some worms. Best place to get worms is from somebody who's already got a worm farm. If you can't get them from them, then get them from a gardening store where you can just buy them. Okay, what you will need is a number of worms. In a pot, you need about 1 kilo of worms, or 1 kilo of soil and worms. Okay, so once you've got those, the next thing you need to do is go about setting up your worm farm. First thing is, usually worm farms come with a coir block. This is a peat block. If they don't, just use shredded newspaper. Soak the block or the newspaper, get it nice and damp. Put a layer in the bottom of the first tray, which is about 2 centimeters deep. And you want to get a nice layer of that, and then it's on the top of this that you're going to lay your worms. So you then take your worms, put a layer of worms on that, and then lastly on top of the layer of worms, put some more shredded newspaper, shredded paper, or some more of the coir block. Then put a carpet over the top of it, and you can pop the lid back on. In a few days, or in a day or so, the worms will have settled down, and you can begin feeding them. So how do you go about feeding worms? Well, you're basically just going to feed them the vegetable scraps from the kitchen. Now, worms eat rotting vegetable matter, so the smaller your kitchen scraps are chopped into, the quicker they're going to rot, the sooner the worms are going to get into eating them. So you should chop your vegetables up, or alternatively, if you've got a food processor, you could shred them, and then they will go down even quicker. So you add your vegetables into the worms, mix it in with a little bit of shredded paper occasionally, pop the carpet back on the top, and the worms will just get in there and start eating. Worms can typically eat, say, an ice cream container worth of food on a weekly basis. So they don't consume huge amounts of food, but they do produce a fabulous product, which is the compost and the tea, which they make. Okay, so things not to feed them are meat and dairy. The reason for not feeding them then is that meat and dairy will tend to go off before they get eaten and can create a bad smell. And also, worms don't generally like to have too much citrus or too much onion. And I think the reason for that is that it can acidify the environment, and worms do not like acidic environments. Okay, so you've feeding your worm farm. You also want to make sure that there's some moisture in there. And so if it's getting dried out, you could add a bit of water. You don't want to put too much water in though, because you do not want to drown your worms. So you just want it to be so that if you were to squeeze the mixture, obviously make sure there's no worms in there, then there would just be a couple of drops would come out. It wouldn't run water. Okay, the other thing you want to do with your worm farm is make sure that you look after it by keeping it out of direct sunlight. You don't want your worms to get too hot. And that's really all there is to it. And then once you've got this all set up, then what you can do is keep feeding the worms. Over time, they will begin to compost and rot down all of the vegetable matter you've put in. Once a tray is filled, you can take the carpet off, pop the next tray on top of it, begin to fill that up with shredded paper and vegetable scraps. The worms will migrate up into the new layer, and once that's going, take it off, remove the bottom layer, which is now full of compost, pop the other one back on, and then you've got a tray of compost ready to use. The compost can be used as a top dressing, can be put around pot plants, or can be mixed with other soil to improve the soil in your garden beds or pots. And the other product which you're going to get from the worm farm is the worm tea or worm wee, which you can collect through the tap. It's a brown liquid, dilute it 1 to 10, use it in a watering can or a spray and put that onto your garden. It will really improve the way your garden grows and will feed your plants really well. And of course, the exciting thing about keeping worms is that the last thing you get from a worm farm is lots of worms. Lots of worms are always popular. You can wrap them in a box, tie on a ribbon and give them away as a present. Everybody loves getting worms for Christmas. Okay folks, that's it. Thanks very much for your attention and happy worm farming.